Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So our first question that we had is, what is the vaccine validation process? And was the process different for COVID? This question is recommended for Bob Ellis or Mark Zabel.
Um, that's a great question, and thank you for that. First, I just wanted to, before I answer that question, I just want to thank everybody for attending. This is a joint operation between the Center for Healthy Aging and Science on Tap, and Charlotte and Amanda are the graduate students that run Science on Tap, and very grateful for their help and support. Um, the validation process is a very stringent process that the FDA puts into place. It involves three different phases. Phase one is typically a safety clinical trial in humans, just to make sure that the vaccine, it doesn't even really address how well it works in phase one. It's really how safe it is. And they do these clinical tests on a very limited number of healthy individuals to make sure that it's safe. In phase two, that's when they start to look at, does the vaccine create an immune response that researchers expect? Do you generate those antibodies? Sometimes they'll even assess whether or not you get that T cell mediated immunity that's super important for virus infection control that you may have heard about too. And in that stage, they also increase the number of individuals enrolled in those trials as well. And then in phase three, this is where they really start testing whether or not the vaccine will be protective against the disease that they're trying to vaccinate against. So in this case, it's COVID. And I believe, and especially in the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, those are both really new mRNA vaccines. They wanted to make sure that they can actually protect against COVID if those individuals are exposed. So they vaccinate those individuals and then essentially just ask them to go about their normal activities, and in the hopes that they will be exposed to COVID. And then they look at, divide these individuals into two groups, those that receive the vaccine and those that don't. And then they essentially count the rate of infection in those two groups. And you've heard probably the explanation of the percent effectiveness. This is simply saying that in the control group, we had 95% of the individuals that contracted COVID in that control group, and only 5% of those individuals that received a vaccine actually contracted COVID. And that's where they're getting that 95% effectiveness number. And in this case too, they also increase the number of people that are being vaccinated to increase the number of individuals that are assessed. So once they do all of that, and at each phase, actually, the researchers will submit their data to reviewers, typically at the FDA. They may have expanded the number of reviewers to do what we call in the research community peer review. And they look at the safety data in phase one and they say, yes, you can go to phase two. Then they look at the immune and safety data in phase two and say, yes, this looks good, go to phase three. And then in phase three, they look at the data again and say, yes, it looks effective, it looks safe, it looks like it's creating an immune response, that looks great. They take all of that data and then they do validation, right? And then so they take that to, again, the FDA and probably peer reviewers as well. And then they look at all of the data from all of those phased trials. And they're looking for safety, how many adverse side effects occurred. They look at antibody titers. Did these individuals generate a lot of antibodies? And then finally, the proof is in the pudding, right? Did it protect them from getting COVID over the control groups? And that's the stage that they're at right now. They do ask in phase three that the trials after vaccination and potential exposure, that period of time lasts at least 2 months. Usually in most vaccine trials, that is extended for a much longer period of time. to make sure that the vaccine is safe. So again, according to the Hippocratic Oath, we don't want to do any harm. So that is the number one criteria. It has to be safe. So how did these vaccines make it through these trials so much more quickly? A typical vaccine, the fastest it goes through these different phases is 4 to 10 years. How did these researchers accomplish this in such a short period of time? It's a couple of things, and they're probably not surprising to y'all. It's money, and it's the number of individuals that are in these trials. So I believe that the US government under Operation Warp Speed gave Pfizer $2 billion to develop their vaccine. I think AstraZeneca received over $1 billion. I believe in that original CARES Act, the Congress allocated over $8 billion to vaccines, diagnostics, and testing. And most of that, I believe, went to the vaccine trials. So to give you an idea of the enormity of that money, someone like me or Dr. Ellis or all the other research, Dr. Earhart, anybody, John Vulcans on this call, they know that their typical research grants are maybe $1 million over 5 years. A bigger research grant might be, a program project grant that's $5 to $10 million over 2 years. We would never see one of our grants receive $2 billion in 1 year to develop anything. So you can imagine that makes a big difference and a big impact. So that's one. The other thing is you would, as a researcher, you would apply for grants at each phase of the trial, right? So I would apply for a grant for preclinical trials for a vaccine development. It looks good. I publish some papers, and then I apply for another grant for phase 2. Same process. And then I apply for another grant for phase 3. That could take, 2 to 15 years for me to get a vaccine to market in that way. This warp speed allowed researchers to have unlimited resources, and that allowed them to enroll many, many more individuals than they would otherwise in a typical trial like I just described. So, if you could get 2,000 people enrolled in your trial, that's a huge clinical trial. And I believe if you look at all of the vaccines that are in development now, it's tens of thousands, approaching hundreds of thousands of individuals that are being included in these trials to test these vaccines. So when Pfizer comes back to the FDA and asks for emergency use authorization, and they finish their phase 3 trials in the shortest time span possible, which is 2 months, then they look at all of that data. And what really helps them to get that emergency use authorized is the vast number of people that have already been enrolled, and the very, very low side effects, the very, very high effectiveness, and the very robust immune response that these vaccines are generating. And so that's why they were able to shorten that time frame about almost tenfold. All it takes is a few $1 billion and a few 100,000 volunteers. Bob?
Yeah, I definitely second what you've said, but I'll add a little bit to that too. And it was leadership from our executive branch and legislative branches in Congress that allowed all of this to happen. And it happened not just warp speed as far as the research, but seemed to me like it was warp speed in the release and the procurement and the release of that money too. So really, there was a huge amount of cooperation that got this off and running. Then also the phase 3 trials, like Mark mentioned too. Bear in mind that we're not going to go out and expose people on purpose to COVID-19 disease or to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So the people in the vaccinated group and the placebo group that did come down with disease came down through it through community exposures. And these were, I don't know if you'd call them natural exposures, but they were exposures that took place in day-to-day life. So that's how we ended up with the numbers of people that were exposed. And the third thing that I'll add is, well, let's emphasize the safety, because this goes on a little bit further in another question, and we'll come back to it. But the third thing that I want to add is that a lot of these trials took place in many different countries, many different races, many different ethnicities, so that we do have a good cross-section to study with the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. Even though these are the first two that are going to be asking for emergency approval are new technologies. They've been in the research programs for years. They just hadn't had a chance to really get out there and do trials with them. So that's where we are with this. And I think it's just near miraculous that this has taken place, both from cutting through the red tape and from getting a lot of people involved, on board, and getting the research done, getting it focused, and getting the results out there as quickly as they have done.
Yeah, I totally agree, Bob. I just wanted to mention also that in the chat, I did put a link into an FDA site that explains emergency use authorization and the process involved with that. It's really informative if you guys are interested in checking that out.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to ask this one to John because he has to go really soon. But here's the next question. Can we still go do things outside, like exercise when the weather is okay? How does the cold affect the virus or droplets? And this one's for John or Bob Ellis.
Yeah, I'll go first, and then maybe Bob can play cleanup after me again. He's good at that. Great question. Yes, you can go outside and exercise, as long as you can withstand the weather outdoors. The evidence for the effective temperature on the stability of the virus is pretty mixed, but what I have seen in the literature is that it's not a huge effect as whether it makes, a big difference as far as the virus being more infective. We do see less infectivity, we think, in the summer and more in the winter, but that may be more related to our behaviors and less to the actual temperature stability of the virus. There have been some laboratory studies that have shown that the virus may be slightly more stable at cold temperatures, so potentially worse, but we're talking a stability increase of like 10 to 15%, nothing momentous there. And so in my mind, you don't really need to worry about thinking about the virus being more dangerous outside in the wintertime. I don't think that's the case at all. It's more about our behaviors that we don't like to be outside. We like to congregate inside in the wintertime. And that's where wintertime infectivity rates rising is largely from, not from the temperature.
And I would second again what John has said. I think that's a really good explanation of virus and virus stability. If you think about this, the virus really isn't very stable at all in the warm ambient temperatures that we have right now. So if you get a lot of people together in rooms that don't have as much aeration, don't have as much airflow, don't have as much clean air replacing the already breathed air, then I think we're going to have an uptick a little bit in some of this. So that comes back to personal protection, wearing the protective devices that you can wear. The masks have been shown to be quite effective. And regarding masks, if some of you are Coloradoan subscribers or readers, there was a really good article in the Coloradoan yesterday on mask wearing mandates and then some of the protection gaps with or without masks. So the mandates don't tell you exactly what to do, but for crying out loud, if you're going to wear a mask, you don't just cover your mouth and you don't just hang it around your neck. Bring it up over your nose and try to keep it so that it's fairly tightly fitting over your face. We sort of tongue-in-cheek circulated an article that Allie found and sent around to us a couple 3 weeks ago that said, oh, by the way, somebody actually discovered and proved, it wasn't a discovery, it was a proof that our nostrils do communicate with our lungs. Therefore, this is a respiratory disease. if you're breathing out through your nose, you can be breathing this virus out into the atmosphere around you. And like I said, this was a little bit tongue in cheek, but man, if people would just do that, it would really be helpful.
Thank you so much for those answers. Our next question is about Christmas travel, which I'm sure we're all thinking about and planning for right now. So is it safe to travel for Christmas by plane? What precautions should I take if I do want to fly a long distance or to go see my family? And this is for Nicole or Bob.
I can take a first crack at this, Bob, if that's okay.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, so of course, what's on everyone's mind is trying to get to family for the holidays. And I think that, to answer the question about how safe it is a largely individual question, because it depends not only on your own risk factors, do you have any factors that should you actually get COVID that would make your potential course of illness or outcome worse than someone else? And we're aware, I think, as the public, as what those might be: high blood pressure and other things, obesity, et cetera, and many, many others, as you've heard. So certainly anytime when you have a number of different risk factors, it would make your travel more risky. Having said that, it's pretty interesting to read some of the data that's coming out recently about your risk of exposure on planes. And the most recent data that came out says that a plane is actually one of the more safer indoor environments, maybe even safer than, for example, a crowded grocery store. So, those are two kind of competing things that you have to balance in terms of your own risk tolerance and, willingness to be in a position where you could get exposed. Now, the plane's only one part of travel, right? So there's still the airport, there's still, the boarding the plane, et cetera. And so clearly in all those cases, you want to be wearing your mask and an appropriate fitting mask. If it's possible to travel at off-peak times where there's likely less people on the plane, that's better. More because the crowding as you get on and off the plane, but also while you're on the plane. And the final thing would be just to, be cognizant of, your own, your own potential health risks that could make your outcomes worse. So is it safe? You can't really give an answer to everyone that would match, everyone's particular situation, but I think you probably have some ideas about your own, willingness to put yourself at risk of exposure. Yet planes are doing a pretty good job at staying clean and keeping the air healthy. Bob, do you have more to add? I'd love to hear you.
I have a lot more to add, and we covered this. I think it was on our last one of these conferences. And yeah, what you said, I dug up some literature information on that the planes now, most every plane has HEPA filtered return air on it. So from that standpoint, the plane is not that big a risk. But from the other standpoint, I think it's the crowding and it's the odds that you're playing. How many people are you going to be rubbing shoulders with, not just on the plane, but also in security, walking into the airport, at baggage, public transportation, if you take public transportation, on and on and on. So I think it's an odds game that if you want to play it, really protect yourself. Otherwise, probably be better to stay home and have some virtual Christmases. We did that with my family for Thanksgiving, and I was amazed. It worked out great. We just had a wonderful Zoom Thanksgiving, and we were on for hours with each other, which surprised us all. It just seemed to fly by, and we had a really nice visit, face-to-face visits, and really enjoyed it. So there are options, and think about it, see what's happening nationally, see what's happening in the States, and then you decide what you want to do and how well you can protect yourself.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think that's really good information, especially right now where everyone's trying to buy a plane ticket or decide if they're going to travel. All right, on to our next question. And just, I'm going to start filtering in the questions that people are asking in the chat too. after this one. So this one's directed to either Mark or Nicole, and this goes, how long before the general public might gain access to the vaccine?
Well, I can go ahead and give what I know anyway. Well, I do know that right now, vaccine doses for Pfizer are being pre-positioned throughout the state. And one of the things that it depends upon is ultra cold temperatures. So some of that's dependent upon where those freezers are available. But if Pfizer and Moderna receive their emergency use authorization, the estimates that are coming from the FDA right now is that the earliest we could see this vaccine starting to be distributed would be in December 14th, somewhere around that timeframe. The way the state of Colorado, as best I know and have heard from colleagues at the state level, will be distributing vaccine is in tiers. And tier 1A will be healthcare providers and frontline workers, and tier 1B will be vulnerable populations. We expect that will include folks over the age of 70, people with pre-existing conditions, et cetera. It hasn't been clearly discussed with me anyway, or I haven't been privy to the conversation as to what exactly that will look like. So that's kind of the first group of people that will get vaccinated. And your question about when will the general public, like, the rest of us who may not be in a vulnerable population or frontline workers, be able to receive vaccines. Some of that depends on how many vaccines actually, come to the EUA and actually have approval. But if we're talking about the first Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, estimates are sometime third quarter of next year, somewhere in that range for kind of Joe Q public without some pre-existing issues. That's what I've heard, Mark. I'd love to hear what you're hearing too.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, that's basically what I've heard as well, is that, by December we should have vaccines rolling out, especially by Pfizer. I don't know about Moderna if they've pre-manufactured and distributed as well, but I know Pfizer did, based on the big bucks that they got, and that's great. So yeah, and that's what I've heard. Just to give you a little perspective. The frontline workers and the most vulnerable populations, about 50 to 80 million people in the US alone, depending on how you measure that. And so it's going to be a slow rollout, right? So I think it's estimated the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines together, because this is going to be a global distribution as well. I think US is slated to get about 50 million of those doses. Remember, you have to get 2 of them, so that would effectively cover about 25 million. So I think in that first tier group, we could have everybody in that group vaccinated maybe by spring, starting in December and finish in spring. For the general public, for the reasons that Dr. Earhart mentioned already, that ultra cold storage, especially for the Pfizer vaccine, not so much Moderna, but both of them need to be refrigerated, which does present transport problems. So that's going to be a much slower rollout. I think the first vaccines to hit the general public from those 2 companies is going to be late spring, early summer at the earliest of 2021. But y'all may have heard that too, that Oxford and AstraZeneca have some pretty promising results on their vaccine. Their vaccine doesn't require the same stringent storage requirements. And so May, I don't recall, it may only need 1 dose. I think it's a live attenuated vaccine. So that one it's slower in the pipeline, but once it hits the market, the likelihood of it being disseminated much more quickly is high, because it doesn't have those same storage and transport requirements as the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines.
Thank you both so much. I want to lump 2 questions together next because they're both about vaccines. The first one is, with mRNA vaccines, what are the implications of long-term safety and concerns, given these will be the first commercial vaccines of this type? And this is from Ben Nielsen in the audience. And I want to lump this together with the question, is there a risk of getting COVID from the vaccine? Because I think that's really important to talk about. My little brother actually called me the other day to ask me if he was gonna get COVID if he got the vaccine. So I think these are important. And these can go to anyone who wants to take the field. There wasn't a specific name associated with the first one.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a crack at this one because I kind of set it up with that Oxford vaccine. So yeah, so it's interesting. I have a kind of a background on this mRNA vaccine accidentally. So my lab published a paper last year on a therapeutic for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and prion diseases. And it uses a lot of the same platform as these vaccines for COVID that Pfizer and Moderna produced. It's a liposome that uses an RNA molecule that helps to treat these neurodegenerative diseases. But this is a therapeutic, not a vaccine. How do we get it to the brain? Well, we used a small peptide, a piece of protein from rabies virus, and we stuck it on the outside of our liposome. And that little piece of protein from the rabies virus can get across a blood-brain barrier, which is a huge problem when we're trying to get drugs to treat to treat brain diseases. That's great, and the drug was mildly successful, not as successful as we had hoped. One of the problems we ran into was we were generating an immune response against our therapeutic, and now looking back, hindsight is 2020, right? We were giving them a piece of a rabies virus, the peptide, which is immunogenic, and then we gave it RNA, which is also helps to increase the immune response and is often used as, well, nucleic acid itself is used as to enhance how well vaccines work. And then we have this liposome to package it all. And that forget about the peptide, that's basically the vaccine that Pfizer and Moderna produced. It packages RNA, but that RNA goes into our cells, and then our cells turn that RNA into a protein from the COVID, from SARS-CoV-2, and that's what we make an immune response against. That is a super safe vaccine, theoretically, because you're not injecting any part. The only part of the original virus you're injecting is the plan, the blueprint for one of the proteins of the virus. So that's opposed to something like the Oxford vaccine, which uses a virus as a transporter. So this is a different virus. I think it's an adenovirus that has been used previously to make vaccines. And they put their piece of DNA that makes a protein from the SARS-CoV-2 into that virus. And then they give you that virus. Now, this virus has been used for about 2 decades. It's extremely safe. It's been FDA approved for many vaccines already that we already use. And so we know that it works and it's safe. And so it's more like just plug and play. You just swap out one gene for one virus for another gene for another virus, in this case, SARS-CoV-2. So that one is actually quite safe too, because you're only using that small piece of the COVID. But what about the virus transporter? There is a possibility, because it is still a live virus, although it's attenuated, which means it's not supposed to make you sick. That doesn't mean it's 100% not going to make everyone, 100% of everyone is going to take it and be fine with it. There may be some adverse conditions. Some of the cruder vaccines that we still use are these live viruses or bacteria that have been attenuated so that they don't make you sick, but they do give you an immune response against the real thing. Those have a higher likelihood of causing an illness than these mRNA vaccines or even this Oxford vaccine that uses that shuttle or that other virus to send that vaccine to the immune system. So these are brand new though. So no, these have never been these mRNA vaccines have never been FDA approved. But the reason we started down this technological pathway, the reason why we wanted to use these strategies is because of how potentially safe they actually are. The fact that they're 95% effective is just a bonus. And I know people often ask, would you get the vaccine if it came out? Remember, the FDA is not taking any shortcuts on safety for these vaccines. The reason they're getting through these trials so fast is the sheer number of individuals that are being vaccinated or in the placebo group. So the FDA is not shortchanging the safety requirements, just fast tracking the results and hopefully getting us a vaccine really, really soon.
Well, I'm really glad that Mark took the time to answer it in that way, because that was one of the most thorough answers I've ever heard. And it got it all together. But circling back around, the safety and then the efficacy are what these trials have proven. So yeah, they're safe. They're very safe. We hear people talking about, well, I don't get the flu vaccine because it gives me the flu every year. No, that's ridiculous, because there's nothing live in the flu vaccine. So pay attention to people that really understand what they're talking about when you ask questions about vaccines and vaccine safety and will it cause the disease? Does the vaccine cause the COVID illness? No, there's absolutely no way it can do that directly. So want to make sure that that's very clear to everybody. So no, there's none of the vaccines have any live virus, COVID live virus in there at all. He mentioned that one of the vaccine platforms is an adenovirus, and the adenoviruses that usually are found with people are the one that's being used is even crippled to the point that it doesn't cause disease at all. The only time you would find any risk is for somebody that's severely immunodeficient, has underlying conditions. So they should be under the care and the advice of their physicians in the first place, and get that advice as to whether they would take it or not.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Bob. Thanks. There's no risk that it's going to cause that disease with these 3 vaccines that we've been talking about. That does bring up one reason why we need to have a boost with the mRNA vaccine. So you need to get 2 doses of that rather than the 1. I believe the Oxford vaccine only requires 1. And that's because it is a live vaccine, which means that once it's introduced into the host, it can replicate for a period of time. And that increases the amount of that virus that is expressing the SARS-CoV-2 protein, so that you get a much better immune response. The mRNA vaccines are not alive. So once the RNA gets into a cell, it will be read and decoded into a protein that can help with the immune response. But that mRNA will turn over and degrade and disappear within a few days maximum. And then it's that short burst of exposure to that protein that's made from that mRNA that starts that immune response. It's not going to give you that same big immune challenge that live attenuated vaccine will, and that's why you need to get a second dose.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right, our next question, and this is a really interesting one. How long will it take to obtain immunity from a vaccine? This one, Mark, your name is by this.
Okay.
You want to talk about it?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. So how does this process work? Again, for the Oxford vaccine, the immune response will start a little bit sooner because once it's introduced into the body, it's going to be recognized as foreign by those immune cells, and it's going to start generating that immune response that we want. For the mRNA vaccines, the mRNA first has to be introduced into the body in these liposomes, and then these liposomes will traffic it to our cells, hopefully a lot of immune cells. That's their job, is to take and present pathogens to other immune cells to make that immune response. So, but it has to take up the RNA, and then it has to make that protein within that cell, and then it has to export that protein so that other immune cells can pick it up and start responding to it. So that takes a little bit longer. Typically in both types of these vaccine strategies, it takes anywhere from, I would say, 10 to 14 days to get an initial immune response. But then again, remember, those mRNA vaccines are going to require another boost. So I would say, and that those are separated by weeks apart, I believe, 4 to 6 weeks apart. Once you get that second boost, it's going to take an additional, week or two to really generate that really robust immune response. And importantly, and this is part of the validation process, I'm sure the FDA is looking at, how durable that immune response is. Does it create memory? So does the immune response remember what it saw the first time or the second time with that vaccine? And hopefully, and it sounds like it is, the third, fourth, and fifth time when they see the real thing, the real virus. So in total, for the mRNA vaccines, I would expect, after your first dose, and then you're going to have to wait 4 to 6 weeks for that second dose. So I would say to reach full immunity for that mRNA vaccine, you're looking at 6 to 8 weeks. For that Oxford vaccine, if it is a 1-dose live attenuated vaccine, we're talking about something around 2 to 3 weeks for protective immunity.
And I'd like to add a little bit to that too. Some of the vaccines that we're familiar with do require boosters. For example, tetanus, where it's recommended that you get a tetanus booster at least every 10 years. And when hepatitis B vaccine first came out, it's been over 20 years ago now, it's a modified live virus. It does not cause hepatitis B, but it's extremely good against protecting against it. It develops an extremely good antibody and immune response. And at first it was said that you should have a boost in that every 6 or 7 years, and then it went up to every 10 years. And now it's going up even further than that because of the prolonged immunity that people who have been vaccinated many years ago still possess. So we need to wait until we can see some of the results of these after they get out into the population. Remember, these have only been developed in the last few months. And so, like Mark said, we don't know for sure how long those are going to last. And if they can get us through a season, 2 seasons, 2 years, who knows? Once we can get the level of the virus down, the level of exposure down, and see more about the longevity of the protective immunity from the vaccines, the better we'll be able to answer this question.
Great answers. All right, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about the mental health impacts of COVID-19. And this is a question that we got submitted to us from before the talk. What are the possible long-term mental health impacts of COVID-19? And this is directed towards Deanna, but anyone, if you want to start it off, and then anyone else can take a stab at it.
Oh, sorry, it turned dark during our meeting. Sure, I'll take a stab. I think one of the things that people probably want to remember as we start making progress, and it looks like there may be some light at the end of the tunnel, is that the response and how people deal with getting back to society is going to be as heterogeneous or as different as how people responded to the pandemic. And what I mean by that is, I think for a lot of people, maybe who didn't have as many aspects of their life changed, it may be just pretty much all positive going back to pre-pandemic life. But we have to remember that there were a lot of people who had pretty much every American Psychological Association stressor thrown at them: poverty, loss of job, marital problems, health problems. And so I think we're going to all have to have like a little grace with the fact that the way that people sort of return to civilization after this is going to be very disparate, and really kind of depend on the person and their experiences that they had during the pandemic. And also, even when we return to sort of pre-pandemic life, it's a change. And so I think people sometimes think it's going to be really easy. I think all of us might be a little bit surprised about how we respond to people wanting to hug us or being in a bus or so I'm assuming that we'll see that it takes people, especially people who maybe had some predisposing anxiety disorders or depressive disorders. It may take a little long, and their journey back may be a little bit longer and need a little bit more assistance. But that's like this has been a huge stressor, and that's like anything else, that what you kind of go into that huge stressor with impacts how you deal with it, and it impacts how you recover from it. So in addition to probably some prolonged cases of anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depending on what happened, grief, it'll be something that I think we won't feel completely the effects of people having to adjust back to their new normal. Probably for the rest of 2021, it'll be kind of a slightly different experience for everyone. And I want to encourage people that it is totally normal to be just as upset when things go back to normal and you're asked to pivot in ways that you're not used to now. That's anxiety inducing. So I'm guessing that we'll still have support through like CARES Act and all of these for a little while. And so take advantage if you have anxiety about returning back to life, or if you feel like it's really hard. Just know that's normal too, and that there's people out there to support that transition.
Yeah, really great answer. Thank you. Okay, our next question is about Christmas again, or the holiday season. So this question is directed for Marissa or possibly Bob. Do I need to take any special precautions with mailed presents this year? What if I want to gift edible treats? What about gifts that I've ordered online? Do I need to do anything special before wrapping them?
Well, I'll jump in first, and I'll just say that, and as we've said before, it doesn't appear that food or food packages act as carriers for COVID-19. However, a whole host of other microorganisms can definitely survive for a long period of time on foods. So it's important to bring your best food safety game to the table when you're making holiday treats for other folks, and also to choose things that have a good shelf life. And I would put in a plug also for maybe trying to trend more health to the healthy side, and think about trail mix, granola, or bean soup mixes, because those could be good choices. And I'll pass it over to Bob.
I think you covered it really well, and the overall food safety, I think, is the bottom line on this. Don't do anything unusual. I don't think you need to go any extra steps really to protect against this particular virus. It's not been shown to be transmitted by food. If you read the literature on coronaviruses, and being a rancher, I know this from 30, 40, 50 years ago, that some of the calf diseases that we would see in cattle were caused by coronaviruses, and these could be respiratory as well as intestinal type diseases, but they weren't transmissible to humans. So this particular coronavirus, and there's hundreds of coronaviruses, the particular one that we're talking about that causes the pandemic now has not been shown to be transmitted through hand-to-mouth type transmission. Doesn't say it couldn't happen under extreme circumstances, but it really has not been shown to be done that way. So take Marissa's advice, use good food safety, and it'll not only protect against COVID-19, but a whole bunch of real regular type foodborne diseases.
Our next question is from Susan in the audience today, and she asks, it sounds like the CDC is on the brink of shortening the quarantine timeline. Could you address this and why the evidence, and as to why and the evidence to support this. Thanks for that question, Susan. Does anyone want to start this question off?
Well, I could do that. And I hope you're not getting tired of hearing me talk. And I'm trying to make them fairly short. But I think there's good reason to look at this because we know so much more than we did 6 months ago about the transmission and about contact transmission. We know more about the dose, the qualitative dose. I'm not saying quantitative, not exactly how much virus, how many virus particles, but quantitatively. We also know that a lot of people, and I've seen all the way up to maybe 40% of the people that have this disease are asymptomatic. But what the research is saying, and this is a lot of different types of research, is that the asymptomatic people don't have the viral load usually that the people that are exhibiting symptoms do, so they're less likely to transmit. And so overall, I think we're getting to the point where we can start to look at keeping the transmission down, wearing the masks, and remaining safe with all of this. So keep safe. Don't really relax, but keep watching what's going on and know that you can have mechanisms that will keep you safe.
Hi, it's Rebecca too. And I think, I don't know a lot of the details, but I did see there was a New York Times article this morning, which I don't know if that's what the question kind of came from, is that they're talking about that. And I also think that we know more, like you were saying, Bob, that now we're more aware that it's really those 2 days before you become symptomatic that you really are shedding quite a bit, and they're thinking of those first 5 days. And I would love to see the isolation time period go down, because I think that would be huge for a lot of our older adults who are dealing with having to be isolated for long periods of time. So hopefully that they will make that change. That would be a wonderful thing for people.
Yeah, and if I'm just going to add real quickly that according to the CDC and all this new data that is coming in, mild and moderate COVID cases seem to have a much shorter incubation time than those more severe cases. So if you're asymptomatic or just showing very mild symptoms, the new conventional wisdom is that your infectious window is 10 to 14 days. However, and probably closer to 10 days. However, if you've got a really severe case, it can be 20 days. And if you're hospitalized in ICU and ventilation, you could be dealing with it for even longer than that. So unfortunately for seniors, it may not make as big of a difference unless they do experience more mild symptoms.
Okay, everyone, it looks like our time is about up. Thank you to all of our panelists for these awesome, informative answers. This is exactly, I think, what everybody needed to hear tonight.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Science on Tap, for co-hosting with us. It was great to have you. We look forward to partnering with you in the future too. Thank you.
Yay, thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, everybody. I think this was another really good, informative session.
Yes, thanks, Bob. Good to see you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.